Welcome to the EchoCast. I am Bon, and this is a podcast about video game news, speculation, reviews, and whatever else I feel like chatting about. This week, we'll be talking about Activision returning to the office, new game release scores, Embracer Group's big goals, and much more. A few things before we get started. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform, and if you're on Spotify or iTunes, please review the show. On YouTube, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment with your thoughts or just to say hello. Huge thank you to supporter level patrons PK, The Dawn, Cage Nephilim, and Neuronix, as well as special thanks to producer level patron Hassan. If you are interested in supporting this podcast and my other content, getting ad-free episodes, you can do it for as little as $1 a month. You can check that out at patreon.com/bondiesel. And because of my pending Switch and content, I'll be talking about that. I have kind of remixed the goals and the bonuses and perks for that. So please go check it out at patreon.com/bondiesel. Gaming news this week. I've got 8 stories for you. Story number 1. Activision Blizzard is ending work from home. This week it was announced, I think it was actually leaked in some company emails, that I've seen mixed reporting on this. I've seen like May or July, sometime this summer, Activision is telling their employees they have to come back into the office. I didn't really see if it's going to be like full time or like a hybrid schedule. I know like my work, they have us come in 2 days a week for like half a day. It's a pretty cool deal. And it was mostly fine with us because with the kind of job I have, you kind of need to be in the office at least a little bit. And so it's worked out. The issue is that with video games, especially these huge studios, they not only have people who are 100% work from home, but they've hired people from all over the country, in Activision's case, the United States, and all over the world who are 100% work from home because they can't commute. They're, many hours away and very expensive plane tickets away. So it's not realistic for them to just come in whenever. So this is going to be interesting for me. I don't know if this is supposed to be some kind of way for them to lay people off without actually having to be the bad guys and pull the trigger themselves, because it's not like all of these people can just move. And even if that's an offer, and it probably is, I know multiple people who have gotten jobs at AAA studios, and it tends to be part of the package to move you, to pay for your moving. I believe even like with like Massive, like Ubisoft Massive, I think they even set you up with an apartment for like 6 months or 12 months to help you get adjusted. So at least if you're international is my assumption. And so this is an interesting one because this time when companies need games to come out more than ever, where there is some concern about the economy, even though I think some of that's starting to subside a little bit. This idea of a good chunk of workforces, their workforce not being able to work anymore if they really follow through with this is probably not a great morale booster. You have the pending acquisition by Xbox happening. You have Bobby Kotick, who's the head of Activision Blizzard now, and who's pretty much generally despised by everyone, saying that if that deal doesn't go through, he's going to stick around. This is weird because I'm sure some people have been holding out for the Microsoft deal, because even if Microsoft is a very imperfect company, I suspect a lot of people do expect the general running of Activision Blizzard to improve after the acquisition. So I'm sure there's some people who have been holding out for that to happen and just kind of putting up with the bullcrap. But this may push it over. They also announced, I think they were cutting like 40% of their bonuses as well. And so we're in a weird spot where you may see people still holding out for that deal, but a couple things may happen. A lot of people may leave just because of this bonus cut and the work from home getting taken away. Because even if these people are willing to move, this is a point I lost a minute ago, it will take more than a couple months for most of these people to figure that out. And so there's a chance that a few things are going to happen. The Microsoft deal falls through. I don't think it will. I still think that's going to happen. We'll talk about that in another story. But if it falls through, you're going to see a mass exodus from Activision, I think, because that will mean that carrot on the string is gone. The chances of things getting better are gone. Kotick says he's sticking around, so that's going to turn a lot of people off. They've lost their bonuses and they have to move, or at least go into the office, even though it seems like it was working with them not doing that. That could be really bad for Activision Blizzard. And then there is kind of a funny story that happens after that, and that things get real bad for them. Their value goes down significantly. And then what if someone tries to acquire them again? What if Sony goes for them, or Embracer Group, or EA? Or EA is a company, I know people talked about it getting acquired. I actually think EA is in a position that it would be possible for them to acquire. I've seen EA and Ubisoft as a really interesting pairing, as maybe like a partnership, maybe not straight up one buys the other. Because I think the renaissance that EA is having recently is what Ubisoft needs to have. That's a different story though. So there could be a situation where that deal falls through and Activision just tanks because they lose everyone. There's also a weird situation where the Microsoft deal continues to get pushed and pushed and pushed on what's going to happen. People are unhappy with Kotick. They're unhappy with pay cuts. They're unhappy with having to move or this change in procedure. And people leave the company before the acquisition happens. Then the acquisition goes through and Microsoft gets left with an Activision Blizzard that's gutted. And then the leader, Bobby Kotick, runs off into the sunset with his bag of cash. And now you have these, you still have the IP. You would still have a lot of people around, but you may not be left with an Activision Blizzard that can immediately get on putting out games. You may have to rebuild it a little bit. Now, that said, I would say there's a chance that if the acquisition goes through, it will make the company more attractive to people. So maybe people would come back, or they would be able to replace the losses with new employees. But this whole thing is weird. I think this was a weird call for Activision to do as this deal is pending and being litigated. I've seen some people propose that this is Activision trying to make itself look as bad as possible to make the deal look better, to get it out of their hands, basically. Bobby Kotick specifically. I think that's too smart. I think that's too strategic. I think they're just doing what these big companies do. I don't necessarily think that like asking people to come back to the office is some big sin, but I think doing it that quickly, I think doing it to people who have maybe been working for your company for a couple of years, but live nowhere near you, to try to make that turnaround happen in a couple months, I don't think it's going to work out well. I think people are really going to dislike that. And I think that is reasonable. For sure. So it's a story worth keeping an eye on. My guess is how I think this is really going to work out. I think especially employee sentiment and then like community sentiment, pushing back on that, the outcry that's going to happen and is happening will make them change their mind, or at least push it out for like a year or something. I've also seen a lot of discussion amongst other large AAA devs and publishers of devs being like, well, if Activision Blizzard can make this decision, who's to say Ubisoft or EA or any of these other companies won't, who, so far haven't done that. But then you also look at like an EA who has kind of thrived, in my opinion, over COVID times, and, is putting out good games. You have a game like Dead Space Remake and stuff where I assume at least a big chunk of that development happened remotely, and likely still is to a point. So seeing the anxiety around the whole business has been interesting, because you can tell that people know that these big companies, these big devs, publishers, like to kind of watch what everyone else is doing, and they aren't really afraid to do it as well. So we will see. I'm very curious to see how this all works out, and I will update you all as we find out more, or we don't. I have no idea. Story number 2 is just a whole bunch of new releases. Straight up, I've played about 2 hours of one of these games, so I'm mostly going to report the reviews I've watched for all 4 of them, and just the general conversation I've seen around them, with a little bit of my input. So Wild Hearts, which is a Monster Hunter clone, basically, by Bandai Namco, and it's being published by EA. Again, this is another one of those kind of EA success stories. Like It Takes Two, this, I believe they've had a few other games that they've published in partnership with a more established studio. Metacritic of 78, OpenCritic of 79. And this is a weird one, because if you go pick 5 random reviews of this game, at least in my experience, I'm surprised this isn't closer to a 90 Metacritic and OpenCritic. I would say about 7 points. I would say this is probably an 85 average if it didn't have substantial performance issues on all platforms, especially PC, especially Series S. This game is not on the old systems. It's not on the Xbox One or PS4. And apparently on the Series X and the PS5, it runs okay. That was my experience. It ran fine for me. I also didn't play it a super long time, but on PC, it's bad. On Series S, it's pretty bad. Now, supposedly they have a day 1 patch coming that is supposed to fix a bunch of it. If it does, I'm gonna feel bad for them, because from everything I've seen people say is this game probably deserves like a mid 80s rank, like a 4 out of 5 or 8 out of 10, however you want to rank it. And it's close. It's a Metacritic of 78 and an OpenCritic of 79, so it's right there. It's just people glow about this game. Everyone I've seen talk about it, they say basically the graphics aren't very good, especially for being a next gen game, and the performance is bad, but the gameplay is just second to none. The story you don't expect much from because of the genre it is, but that apparently the gameplay is just wild and it's super good. And that was my experience in a pretty short amount of time. I've tried Monster Hunter games. I do not like them. They're way too much of a slog. I'm too like ADHD, or I have too short of an attention span to really get into games like that. So it's just not my thing. And I think that's okay. But Wild Hearts, I enjoyed. I'm probably not going to buy it, if I have to be totally honest. I don't plan on dropping the cash on it. I really, really, really hope it comes to Game Pass eventually. It has a 10-hour preview through EA Play, which you get with Game Pass. And so that's how I played it. And I'll probably finish out my 10 hours eventually. But yeah, this is a game that I wouldn't let the score put people off. I honestly think it should be a few points higher. But I think it's being held back by its performance. So assuming that gets fixed, keep an eye out. I would suggest getting this game if it's your genre, if it's your style. Wanted Dead came out, and it has a Metacritic of 60 and an OpenCritic of 61. This one's a bummer. This looked like kind of like a old 360 era, PS3 era game, where you have this badass lady with a sword and guns, and it was just going to be like an action brawler, fun, borderline goofy game. It looks good. It has nice graphics. And it looks like it should be like an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10, but pretty consistently all the reviews are just it's shallow, it's repetitive, it's not that fun. I did see someone point out that it has the best kick of any game that one reviewer has ever played, and I will say that the footage they showed, it was a pretty satisfying kick. It just seems like it's it's one of these games that looked like it was going to be a big deal, and they had all the right polish on it, but they just forgot to make it fun to play. And I guess the enemy variety is minimal. It's just, if you play it for an hour, you've basically played the whole thing, and then you have to go play it for another 10 or 15 hours to beat it. So I'm bummed about this. This was a game I planned on buying if the reviews were good, and I'm not going to buy it. Luckily, that we have the saving grace of Game Pass, and maybe they'll have a little time to fix some of the issues people have with it. So I can hope I play a version of it that's better eventually. But you hate to see a game get scores like that, because in the eyes of a lot of people, it's a failure at this point already. This was the first game from a new studio. It seems like it was a good start, even if this initial showing wasn't as good as I'm sure they hoped. So I'll be curious to see what they do next with some taking the criticisms and things like that to heart. And, hopefully they come back stronger, and we'll see what their next project is. Octopath Traveler 2. Metacritic score of 86 and OpenCritic of 86. Tied up. So Octopath Traveler is a game I tried to play recently in the last year or two, and man, I got like an hour into it. My big dumb jock brain just can't. I'm too simple for these games. I'm too impatient, like I said before about Wild Hearts, about like the Monster Hunter games. Octopath Traveler is not my game, but for people whose game it is, this second one seems extremely good, hinting the scores. A big thing I saw or heard when I was listening to reviews about it is that a lot of the repetitiveness and the procedural way that the first game played out with different stories of the different characters is mixed up really well and has been addressed in this new one. So if you liked almost everything about the first one, I bet they fixed most of what you didn't like for the second one, and it seems like it's extremely good. I'm really excited to see what comes of this. If it ever comes to my plate, I may give it a try if it flops out in front of me. But this is one that I'll probably be passing on. But if this is your thing, it seems like it's a really, really good option to go for. Then the final game, Like a Dragon Ishin, has a Metacritic of 81 and OpenCritic of 81. Again, same score here. This is one where I have seen, I think, at least one, if not multiple, 10 out of 10s from like pretty well respected journalists who don't just throw those out. I think these Like a Dragon games have their audience, a kind of a niche. I'm even only familiar with one of the more recent ones. So I don't really know if this is going to be my thing. It's like one of those things I want to keep an eye on. But seeing it get a score of 81, it makes you realize, and if I've seen 9s and 10s out of 10s, it means I didn't hit for everybody. I have, the reviews I saw said that a lot of the systems aren't the best, like the combat and stuff like that, but the game, the genre it's in, it's not really, that's not really the focus. But that the story, the interactions, a lot of it's a based on true events, and some kind of a transition from old Japan to new Japan. It seems like people really enjoy a lot of that, and the characters and the storytelling. It's just the actual combat, which people care about, isn't that satisfying, and it seems like it probably suffered a bit because of that from people who aren't like big time Like a Dragon stans. Okay, we have story number 3. Microsoft and Sony secretly negotiating. There's a possible meeting by Microsoft and Sony on February 6th. This came from people paying attention like psychos to private flight records and noticing that the Sony, either the Sony or the PlayStation executive jet flew to Seattle, where Xbox is stationed. There are talks about how there are developers in that area. It is possible that they were there for a meeting with some of their own, but knowing that this coming week Xbox is supposed to start meeting with regulators to figure things out and see if they can work out a way to get this deal through. It seems a little too convenient that they just happened to meet, a week or so or 2 weeks before that was going to happen. I think that they're probably trying to hammer out deals. I'm sure Microsoft is trying to, without giving up everything while still making this deal worthwhile, are probably trying to figure out what they need to do to get Sony off their back, because multiple organizations and businesses have come out against the deal, but Sony seems like the big kind of drumbeat behind it. And I'm sure Microsoft is pretty eager to do what they have to do to get them to back off, because then I think we see a lot of the pushback layoff. But we'll have to wait and see. Like I said, this coming week, Microsoft is supposed to be meeting with regulators in the EU, I believe, and I want to say the CSA. It's either one or the other or both, I can't remember. And that will likely be them beginning the process of, okay, what do you want us to do? We're not going to give up Call of Duty. We're not going to cut off Blizzard. Those are silly ideas. What are your real ideas? Because those are obviously to get people going in the media and the fan bases and stuff like that. So to be a fly on the wall of that meeting would be really interesting. But unfortunately, that will not happen. But I bet we hear stuff about it pretty soon after. This is where we start to get into some of the smaller stories that I'll kind of buzz through a little bit quicker. Story number 4, Saudi Arabia has increased its stake in Nintendo to 7%. So if you don't pay attention to world events and stuff like that, most of the Middle Eastern countries that have been and still are very dependent on oil revenue, I think kind of see the long-term issues with that industry and that it may not be very profitable. Eventually, it'll be a while. So you've seen all of them starting to invest into other stuff. And Mohammed bin Salman, who is essentially the leader of Saudi Arabia, appears to legitimately have an interest in video games, and he's, I believe, in his 30s, if not early 40s. So he came up, in a world that video games were popular, and he sees it as a good place to put their money to try to, grow revenue in places that aren't underground in their country. The issue is, amongst many, like the way people are treated in their country, so on and so forth, is that Mohammed bin Salman is also known as Mohammed Bonesaw. Specifically due to an incident where a critical reporter who was based in the United States was essentially, I believe it didn't happen here, it happened overseas, but he was living in the United States, was essentially lured into an embassy, murdered and chopped up, and his parts supposedly returned to Saudi Arabia to be disposed of. It was made pretty clear that the footage that was captured of him going into the embassy being, I think, preceded and then people leaving afterwards who are known associates of Mohammed bin Salman and kind of a cleanup crew for him. It's pretty well believed that, he's never been seen again, and they left with large cases that they're fairly certain were likely the body parts of this individual. So that, amongst a bunch of other issues that Mohammed Bonesaw has people feeling weird about them investing into Nintendo specifically. Now, Nintendo has kind of that sterling reputation where issues like this don't stick to them as much. You see Tencent, getting involved in other companies, and those companies catch a lot of flack for that. The problem is that since Nintendo is a publicly traded company, they don't really have a say over who owns what of their company. They have some control of it, but at the end of the day, it's not like Saudi Arabia called and asked their permission. They just did it, and they didn't ask their permission to buy out more. They just did it because if I think it's Aramco or something like that, is the Saudi Arabian oil company. It's a private company, so we don't know how much money they make because they don't have to reveal it. But it's believed that they're a multi-trillion-dollar company, which would make it the richest company and the most powerful company in the world, probably by a few magnitudes. So, we're in a moment where I think people are getting a little bit of fatigue about like, oh, that game is made by so and so who's associated with this. This is what we saw with the Hogwarts Legacy. But you can't just give up on things because they become annoying. You can't just whatever, who cares. I mean, you can, but you shouldn't. But I think maybe it's good for people to really focus and to really make sure what issues seem like they're really worth getting mad about. Because if you're looking to be upset about things, you're going to be upset about everything. If you regretfully accept that there's just going to be a level of bullcrap one way or the other in most systems of life, I think once you accept that, you can kind of prioritize your outrage. I guess one issue with this is that once they own enough, and they may have enough now, they would technically deserve a seat on the board of Nintendo. And if they pursue that, people are concerned that they will start to vote and show influence on the types of games that Nintendo makes, and start doing things that would lead Nintendo down a path that may eventually lead to people actually being upset about this ownership situation. It's hard to tell, I'm a little... Nintendo is like insanely protective of their IP, of their image, of all that stuff. And so, money talks, and no company is immune to these things. But I find it really hard to believe that they would get undue influence. Now, at the same time, you also have to remember that I believe, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments or by another means, that Japan is still a relatively conservative country, and so they aren't necessarily out there beating down the door of like blowing everyone's mind with their as a bunch of wonderful people would call it, their wokeness, which is a phrase I absolutely despise because of reasons. I think having empathy for people should be a good thing. We shouldn't demonize it. But anyways, I take a little break. It can be a slippery slope, but at some point, like I said before, we have to kind of set some kind of bar for where we start freaking out about stuff, because basically every game developer and every publisher has blood on their hands in some capacity. Almost every game probably has someone attached to it somewhere down the line that is extremely undesirable. And I don't think we should stop pointing those things out, and I don't think we should stop paying attention to that, like with the Hogwarts Legacy situation. But at some point, you do have to kind of accept that a lot of people just want to buy a game and play it and not worry about all of the other issues around it. We're definitely seeing that with Hogwarts Legacy right now, where it's selling up there close to how Elden Ring sold. It's probably going to be in the Game of the Year conversation, even though it does not seem like a game that actually deserves that. That's where we're at. And I suspect that Saudi Arabia and China and these other places are only going to continue to invest more all over the world with all of the game companies that we like. And I think each person has to kind of decide how they are going to react to that. Story number 5 brings us to another giant ownership group, the Embracer Group, and how they are planning on releasing a new game at least every 12 months. I believe this was specifically speaking on AAA games. And it was really interesting. As part of this kind of statement in this article I was reading, they pointed out that they wanted to make AAA games that they were confident would sell at least 2 million copies each. Now, 2 million copies is no slouch. 10 million is kind of like if your game says 10 million, it was a huge success. And we see that happen fairly often, especially with multi-platform games. But for 2 million to be the goal is just, it's interesting. Now, they must have some metrics, or they must know something we don't about why that is a number that they are happy with. I just find it really interesting. That doesn't seem like enough. When you have games like the recent Assassin's Creed games and the Division and a lot of Ubisoft games, for as much crap as they get, pretty consistently sell more than 10 mil each. The Division 2 sold 10 mil a long time ago, which means it's probably a significant number higher than that at this point. I've always said that sales doesn't necessarily mean quality, not to make anyone mad, but The Big Bang Theory was on for a long time. And that also might be one of the worst shows I've ever watched in my entire life. But someone was watching it, someone liked it. And so, you know, it's we have an interesting relationship with quantity sold doesn't always match up with quality. We've seen it with games like Guardians of the Galaxy, which was one of the best games I've ever played, and it didn't sell well. It suffered a lot, I think, somewhat from Avengers fatigue, you know, like Marvel fatigue, but there was also the Avengers game that came out not long before it, and I think a lot of people thought this was going to be a similar experience, where the Marvel Avengers game was trying to be like Destiny, and Guardians of the Galaxy was the closest thing to a new Mass Effect we've gotten. It was very linear, and it wasn't as like wide open as like the Mass Effect games, but a very, very light Western RPG that was really well written and well voice acted, and just one of the prettiest games I've ever seen. But the Guardians of the Galaxy, for multiple reasons, is almost guaranteed not to get a sequel, because it didn't sell very well, which really stinks because it was just such a good game. So, you know, a $2 million sale copy for each of these games is, if that's the goal, they'll probably do it. Some of the games that Embracer Group has coming are Dead Island 2, which went gold recently. This is almost a famous game at this point, because it's been in the works for so long, and I still don't think people believe it's coming out, but we'll have to wait and see. We've got a new Deus Ex coming, even though that's going to be interesting without Mary DeMarley with them anymore, who she's now on the next Mass Effect game, and she was instrumental to those Deus Ex games, but someone will take it over. Payday 3, which is another game that's been pretty hotly anticipated, the new Tomb Raider reboots. And one thing to keep in mind is that Embracer Group owns, you know, a bunch of places now, including devs who are helping Xbox work with Perfect Dark with the Initiative, as well as Fable, which is a Playground, I think, the Forza people. So they've got their hands in a lot of cookie jars, and I think they're just hoping to come out with a consistent $2 million worth of cookies. We'll have to see if they do it. I mean, those properties are great. The problem with Embracer Group is we've been hearing about them for years, and they buy so many studios and they spend so much money, but they don't have much to show for it. And the games they've released kind of recently have both been like borderline just bad. So I'm really curious to what happens with Embracer. I'm curious to who else they embrace, and we'll just have to wait for that. I'm also curious about story number 6. Atomic Heart has controversy. Go figure. So I watched some video and read some articles about what's going on here. And long story short, Atomic Heart is being made by is it Monkfish or Munfish, and their leadership has some what do you call it? Complicated things. Long story short, the leadership of Munfish or Monkfish, whatever it is, has a lot of connections with the Russian government, and it's felt but like the director of the game used to be the head of the biggest social network in Russia, and it's pretty well known that that network is pretty much integrated with the government and is used to spy on its citizens. And then the owner of the company, of the owner of the whole company, the developer, had ties with. She's a former model, but she had some leadership positions and some what is assumed to be some surveillance programs and stuff like that in Russia. So obviously with the Ukraine war and the interference in American affairs, as well as affairs all over the world, people are pretty leery about anything that comes from Russia right now, especially Atomic Heart has a bunch of Soviet time iconography, which it seems like the current leadership of Russia is very friendly to. They very much feel like they're trying to get back to their original level of power and things like that. So I think this will be fine. A big thing that came out, I think it was just today or yesterday. I'm recording this on Friday. The music composer for Atomic Heart, Mick Gordon, is donating all of the proceeds that he was going to receive for this game to various Ukrainian charities, I believe mostly civilian ones. So it seems like a good response. I'm super excited about this game. This is one of those situations where I'm just choosing to not worry too much about its extenuating circumstances. But if I get into the game and stuff feels weird, I'll probably say something, because it's such a ridiculous game. I'm not so worried about it getting really weird, but it could. We have no idea. These things are so unpredictable these days. CDPR couldn't predict Genitals. In story number 7, we had a situation where The Witcher 3 had a big patch recently that was supposed to kind of bump up the graphics, and it accidentally added insanely realistic models and textures of female genitalia, which led to some of the NPCs in the game not having pants and just showing the goods, really just laying it out there, just not shy at all. So, you know, I guess get your rocks off if you want and go look at that. I don't know if it's actually been patched yet. I believe they did something to try to encourage people to not engage with some of this. But obviously there are screenshots all over the internet, and this will just go down as kind of a whoopsie. Who cares? It's just boobs and other parts. But some people are more sensitive to that than maybe I am. But it's still kind of a funny story. They're just giving people what they want. Finally, story 8, we have Tencent is canceling their VR headset. So what I forgot to mention, I just realized, is that the Sony PSVR 2 got reviewed this week by various publications and stuff. And if you remember, I think I talked about it last week or the week before, I predicted that people would like the hardware and be worried about the software. And that's exactly what's happening. So the big game that most of them reviewed the system on was the new Horizon game. And it seems like it's fine. It's basically the best of the very VR centric climbing games and shooting stuff and all that, but with some good polish and some good ideas. But it doesn't seem like it's overly exciting, or like people are saying like you must have a PSVR 2 so you can play this game. Instead, it seems like they're like, oh, this is pretty neat. All of the other games are ports from old games. And that's where it comes down. People like Jeff Grubb and even the Kind of Funny crew, who I listen to a lot, who is very PlayStation centric. They are fans of their PlayStations. Even them, they kind of had this thing of like, yeah, the hardware is cool, the controllers are nice, it feels good on your head. The one chord is not perfect, but it could be worse. But it just all seems like it comes down to, you know, there need to be some killer apps, and it's arguable that even this Horizon game isn't like a killer app. It's just, it's fine. But there's also a fear that Horizon game is the best VR game that comes to PSVR 2. And if that's the case, it's going to struggle. And that's after Sony was already, I think, pulled back on some of the advertising and stuff because their pre-orders were terrible. I'm sure they weren't terrible. I'm sure they sold out most of them, but they weren't what they expected. And it seems like there's a lot of concern about, where they're gonna go from here with the Sony PSVR 2. Now, what I think is that there were grumblings that this was going to happen to the VR 2, and if Tencent was working on a VR headset, they probably saw the writing on the wall and said, "Hey, that's obviously not an industry that's ready yet, and it may never be." I still don't. I don't think current VR is what's going to be the future. I think it's going to be something different, whether it's holograms or whether it's more compact and less obtuse equipment. I don't think VR is ever going to be like the big thing for quite a while. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm sure they'll still, Sony seems dedicated to trying to please that community a little bit, even if not that many people really partake. Those are the news stories. With some of my own stuff, I had 2 Mass Effect videos this week. One was talking about bringing back the Paragon and Renegade system from the trilogy to the next game and all my thoughts on that. The second one was actually really fun to make. I typed into GPT, the AI chatbot, and said, "Hey, like, what's the story of the next Mass Effect going to be?" And it spit out a story, and it was very compelling. And then I said, "Well, what's another storyline it could be?" And it pumped out another one. It was super compelling and very interesting. And I did it a third time, and it was awful. It didn't even finish, right? So during that video, I read the 2 prompts it gives about the story of Mass Effect Next, and they're really, really cool. So if you're on YouTube, just go to the Mass Effect playlist, click on that most recent video to check that out. Or if you're on a podcast, one of the podcast places, check out youtube.com/bondiesel, and you'll be able to see all of my videos. I should have probably close to 60 Mass Effect videos now, and hundreds of other gaming videos. And if you want some old The Division content, you can go check some of that out as well. I did a poll this week about rebranding the podcast and renaming it, actually. A small part of me has wondered if kind of doing a reboot on the whole thing would maybe help with trying to get to kind of boost listenership and stuff like that. I'm not unhappy with where we're at. We've just been really static for like a year and a half or 2 years now, where the numbers are about what they've been, and I've not seen a lot of progress, even though I think, and maybe I'm super biased, that I've made quite a bit of progress with the quality of the podcast and my other content. So I put out a poll saying, "Hey, should I rename the podcast?" And it came back narrowly no, so I won't do it. I trust, there was a number of people, not quite the listenership of the podcast, but big enough that I believe them, and so we'll leave the name alone, the EchoCast. But I think I am going to mess with some branding. I don't know if I want to lean into some like Mass Effect branding, like color scheme wise and stuff like that. That may come at a later date. That might be too soon. But I may mess around a little bit with some colors or stuff like that. Having the green color scheme right now, I actually don't love, because I think while I am an Xbox guy, I feel like it leans too much into Xbox. I used to have it be orange because it was a Division podcast, so I want to stay away from that. I did have blue as my primary color for the podcast for a while. I could go back to that or do like a mix. I actually wouldn't mind having like blue and green, or do like red and blue to kind of signify the Paragon Renegade stuff from Mass Effect a little bit. I don't know. It's a work in progress. We'll get there. But I'm happy to take suggestions. If you have any opinions of your own, please let me know on YouTube in the community part, or in the video comments on Twitter, in my Discord, whatever. Also, the last thing here, I've been streaming on Twitch for multiple years now. I'm gonna take a chance and actually stream on YouTube for a while. Supposedly, if you stream on YouTube, it does help with the algorithm and stuff like that. So my goal this year is to get partnered on YouTube. We're making progress, but I want to speed it up. So I'm going to try to stream on YouTube exclusively for at least a few months. So go check me out over there. Make sure you subscribe over there. Subscriptions on YouTube are free. You actually can't pay me money on YouTube right now. I'm not partnered. So subscribe over there, turn on the alerts if you can. And when I stream, please come check it out. Come say hi. If you're a Twitch sub, you basically have three options. You can end your sub, which is totally fine. I completely understand. You'll be getting basically no value from it. You can leave your sub alone and continue subbing to me on Twitch. I'm almost certain I'll end up back on Twitch eventually, but it may be a while. Or three, you can't like be a member on YouTube until I'm partnered, which I'm not yet. So I would suggest going to patreon.com/BondDiesel and being part of that. More of the money goes to me. I do think the bonuses on there are decent, and I'm always open to suggestions for more. And it's just probably a good place to go. And I have goals on there. Like you get more direct, like on every video and podcast, you get recognized for being a Patreon, where with being a Twitch sub, it's only when I'm there and I say thank you for resubbing. So just something to think about. And that's all I have for this week. I normally take listener questions. I didn't get any this week, so make sure on my Discord, on my Twitter, anywhere in the comments of the video, if you watch on YouTube, ask questions, propose topics. I'm happy to bring almost anything up. And as I say that, I remember that there was actually a question from last week, and I'm going to pull it up now. So last week, Pizza Morgue said, is there a property you'd like to see to get the Hogwarts Legacy treatment? Like it can be any form of media, but seeing that world brought to life in a really detailed way with a clear focus in virtual tourism. I would like to see what jumps right out to me. What? There was the movie where Tom Cruise was fighting these aliens and he kept dying and coming back, and he progressively over hundreds of thousands of lives figured out how to beat these aliens. I would want to see that. What's like live, die, repeat is what like the tagline for it. And I think that's what the movie, its name got turned into, but it was initially something else. But that's what I would want to see. That's not the deepest answer I could give you. But that would be a cool one, I think. And then just as I was recording this, I got questions from Master Prime. Thoughts on the new 2042 season trailer? That's for Battlefield. That is for season 4, which is coming in about a week or so, I believe. I am super pumped for it. My favorite thing to do in 2042 is to get mastery levels on the weapons. So I have the base mastery level for all of them right now, and I've gone up in a few of them. So I'm excited to get new weapons to master. I'm super excited about that. The new operator looks interesting. And the changes they made recently, that game feels so much like a Battlefield game now. It's so good. If you haven't played 2042, if you paid for it but you haven't played in a while, jump in. You'll love it, I think. And if you can find it cheap, I highly suggest getting it and playing it. It's great. Master Prime also asked, do you think we'll be getting any big announcements on E3? For 2042, probably not. There have been rumors that they're making the next Battlefield already, which isn't that surprising. It's supposed to be in like a similar time frame. I don't know what they're doing. It'll be interesting, but I can almost guarantee it's going to be a straight up normal ass Battlefield game from the start, and then maybe they'll trickle stuff in later. I think with 2042 they tried to do it the other way and they messed up. And then would you like to interview a 2042 developer? For sure. And I actually a former Ubisoft Massive employee who I'm a mutual with on Twitter is like one of their big devs. So I should maybe try to reach out to them and see if they would want to chat, because I've I've really enjoyed that game, especially recently. I liked it when it came out. It had issues. It would be really fun to talk to them. I have to remember what their role was with the Division, but it would be interesting to talk to them to compare and contrast how like the Division 1 and 2 kind of started off and how they developed, and how the same thing we see happening to Battlefield as well. So it's a really good idea, and thank you for those questions. Again, if you have your own, go to all the places and ask them. The Discord is the best place. Okay. Well, that's what I have for this week. So thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to get any feedback on the show. If you have it, leave it in any of the places I've been talking about. You can find me all over the internet as Bon Diesel, including on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and on Twitch, technically, but let's focus on YouTube. There's also a @TheEchoCast Twitter account where you can get updates just about the podcast. And I try to retweet and comment on a lot of news on there with very little like personal opinion and without posting like my own content too much. And that's all I have. So until next time.